In the first sections of this chapter, we were talking mostly about raising plants for food, and in this one, we're going to look a little bit more at raising animals for food. So, we produce a lot of meat in this country. We consume a lot of meat in this country. Some of the meat that we produce is consumed here, and some of it is sold as export. Um, the first bullet point where it talks about livestock being grazing on grass, in this, it's not that picture in your mind that might be like the cowboys where they're driving the cows and they're going across the open range. That was more 17, 1800s, early 1900s that happened, but as more and more private land came into play, there wasn't as much space for people to drive cattle like that. And so now the grazing actually occurs on public lands, either on Bureau of Land Management lands or Forest Service lands. The land is already divided up into allotments, grazing allotments or pastures, where there's fences, and then the ranchers will have a lease for a particular allotment. Usually the lease is 99 years, and then they will move their cattle around those pastures in the allotments. The other part of our meat comes from feedlots. And if you drive towards San Diego, you're going along I-5, you'll see feedlots along the road and you'll smell the feedlots. Usually what they have is like centralized feeders, so there's like a line of feeders that's, it's 100 yards long or so, and then the cattle can feed from both sides of that. They're in close conditions. One of the concerns with that is the spread of disease, so that's why our animals tend to be given a lot of antibiotics so that they're not spreading disease in those areas. Sometimes they're not fed hay or alfalfa like our grass-fed cattle are. They're fed on corn a lot of times, or they can be fed other things like fish meal, like it says on here. Fish meal is basically the ground up parts of fish that don't get used for human consumption. So like when you go to the store and you buy fish and it's already filleted and cut and everything, there's the heads and the scales and the bones and things like that. Those are dried and ground up and made into animal feed. So on the plus side of the feedlots, when we're raising them in a smaller area, we can produce more meat in those areas. We can raise more animals for less money, and we use less land. But on the other hand, that land that we do use for the feedlots is pretty much sacrificed. Like, you're not going to be able to do anything on there for a very long time if that feedlot were to leave. It also is concentrating a lot of animal waste into one particular area, and so if you have runoff into your waterways, that can be a significant issue. One of the problems that we can see with the animal waste like that is what's called cultural eutrophication, and we'll talk about this a bit more with the water unit. But basically, natural fertilizers, things that would fertilize plants or increase plant growth, are washed into waterways when rocks decompose or when an animal dies, or just the natural process that are occurring in the environment. When we start to increase the amount of nitrates or animal waste or things like that go into water supplies, we're dramatically increasing the amount of nutrients that are in that ecosystem, and it's a kind of pollution that we'll talk about. The antibiotics get passed along to you if the animals are injected with a lot of antibiotics, that can be transmitted through milk, and so that's why on a lot of milk products you'll see now that those cows are not injected with hormones or with antibiotics, because those get passed along in the milk to the consumer. But there are antibiotics and hormones in some meat, not all meat anymore. But that is also a concern. When we talked about human health, the more that you're exposed to different antibiotics, and the more the germs in your body are exposed to the antibiotics and the bacteria and things like that, the more likely we are to get bacteria that is resistant to those antibiotics, and so then we end up with bacterial infections and things like that antibiotics won't kill, and so that becomes a problem when we're talking about medical practices. In some areas of the world, particularly along long coastlines or island nations, fish and shellfish are a large portion of their diet, and so as those populations increase, so does their need for food. And so that's where that's one reason why we have the increasing amount of fish and shellfish. We also have more nations and people that have a larger disposable income, and so people who wouldn't necessarily be able to afford fish that live inland, more people can afford those things now. And so as their transportation has improved over the last 100 years to be able to transport food in a timely manner so that it's still fresh from, or we have our freezing processes and things like that, or that we can package and preserve foods now, that's also increased the demand for fish and shellfish. So one of the concerns with this is that we'll end up having a decline in species. So there are some species, like some of the lobsters and crabs. I don't know if you've ever seen like the show The Deadliest Catch or anything like that. They actually have quota. They're only allowed to take so much, and if they catch more than that, they actually have to throw it back to protect the populations so that they can still survive and reproduce and be there. So we've given subsidies to the fishing industry. So basically, we pay them either more, like they're given more money for fishing, or they're given lots of tax breaks for their boats and things like that, and that's increased fishing. Like I said, the demand has gone up as well, so that's increased the amount of fish. The other way that we raise fish basically is through what's called aquaculture. And basically this is like fishing, this is like farming in water. So they have cages that are either out in the ocean, or they're in rivers, or in actually like created ponds and things like that, where we can raise fish and shellfish. So there used to be, also on the way to San Diego, there used to be on the north side of the road, there used to be a shrimp farm actually in the middle of the desert. So they had big tanks. They had like big long tanks that you think like a fish hatchery kind of thing. If you've ever been to a fish hatchery, it was very similar to that, concrete ponds where they raised shrimp, and then they sold it here in Arizona. But that one went out of business a number of years ago. So they can also raise them in captivity, so they can capture the fish. They're catching it and raising it in captivity, and then they take the eggs and they raise those fish and that kind of thing. So there's a number of different ways that we can do aquaculture. When we have them in cages and they're in a concentrated area, we have similar issues as what we have to feedlots, because it's in the water, and so you have that large concentration of animals in a smaller place, and they're animals go to the bathroom just like everyone else does, and so when all that's in one small place in the ocean, that's not how the ocean normally is. Normally the fish are all spread out, and so we do have a higher amount of toxins that go in, waste that goes in there. So a mangrove is the trees that the roots, like the tree can sit in the water and the roots are big and tall and they hang out. The picture in the center there is a picture of a mangrove, but it's kind of hard to see. So a lot of times they'll either cut those down in order to make the areas for the aquaculture, or when they put the cages in those areas, the large amounts of waste and things like that can actually kill off other members of the ecosystem, including the plants. But once again, just like the feedlots, when you concentrate it in a smaller area, you can get a higher yield, so you can grow more in a smaller area and have a higher amount of fish growing in that area, so you can increase your profits because you're not having to transport things quite as far or quite as often. We're going to switch back over to talking about plants again. So because with plants, we have to protect the plants against predators and also against pests that would decrease the food supply and decrease the quality of the food. And one of the ways that we do that is with pest management. And there's chemical pest management, and then there's what's called integrated pest management, where we can use biological methods as well. In this particular slide, we're talking about pesticides, the conventional pesticides. So it does increase food production. That's a big plus because you're decreasing the critters that will eat. Pests are not necessarily just bugs, but in this case, usually that's what we're looking at, are bugs. They're fast, they're easy. You can see in the picture that's a helicopter sprayer. They also use crop dusters. They're very fast acting. They can most of them will kill the insect very quickly, which will then decrease the amount of loss that happens in the population or in the plant population. And if they're properly used, they can be safe as long as they're not overused, and that's part of that properly used, and then they're not being sprayed right next to waterways, and they're controlling the runoff and that kind of thing. So on the downside, they do promote genetic resistance in the insect populations themselves, and we'll talk about super pests here in just a minute. Sometimes they kill off the non-target organisms. So if we're going for the corn borer, sometimes that pesticide could kill the corn borer, but it could also kill beneficial insects like butterflies or some bees and things like that are pollinators. The new pest species kind of come out because if we're killing some things off, then other species will kind of move in and take the place of some of the pest species, and the genetic resistance can allow for adaptations, particularly in insects, once again, where that life cycle is pretty fast and they can adapt quickly. If they're not used properly, then that's where we get into that polluting the environment. If they're being used right near a waterway, if they are spraying, over the waterway in particular, if they're overusing, that can be harmful and cause pollution, which then harms people and the environment. So if we have the perfect chemical pesticide, it's going to kill only the bug that we're going after. So for example, we're going to go back to the corn borer example again. And so the ideal chemical pesticide for the corn borer would only kill that corn borer. It wouldn't kill off any butterflies or bees or anything like that. And it's not going to cause any genetic resistance in that corn borer. So they're not going to be able to adapt to the pesticide to the point where it doesn't kill them off anymore. So that would obviously be ideal. And then after it's sprayed, it has a very short half-life where it's going to break down quickly. It's not going to persist or hang about in the environment for a long period of time. Persistence is one of those things that can be a significant concern. In Environmental Science 1, you perhaps talked about persistence as being a problem with biodiversity where chemicals persist in the ecosystem. And DDT was a pesticide that was used in the 50s and 60s, and it's the one that Rachel Carson wrote her book about the use of DDT, because DDT has a really long half-life. It hangs about in the environment for a long period of time, and it biomagnifies, or it stays within the ecosystem. And that pesticide then gets more concentrated as you go up the food chain. And so when you get to the top level predators, for example, the eagles, it causes the eggshells to be much thinner. And so when the mama bird sits on the eggs, she actually cracks the eggs because the shells are so thin. And it was causing a decline in the eagle population. DDT is no longer allowed to be used in the United States anymore. Really, the only place in the world that hasn't banned DDT are countries that are in the tropics that are right around the equator, because they use it to kill off mosquitoes. And the spread of malaria, when they did for a short period of time actually ban the use of DDT, but they found that the deaths from malaria skyrocketed, and they had the consequences for not using the DDT were more severe than the consequences for using it. So we obviously want it to be more cost effective than doing nothing. So we want it to be a better than nothing kind of thing. So if it's not having the benefit that you want, then we need to stop using it and find something else. So here's one of our super pests. So this one is this whitefly here is resistant to some pesticides, and therefore even if you spray it, it's not going to kill it. And so that's one of the things that when we talk about genetic resistance, this is what it creates, are these insects that can't be killed off by our pesticides. And then we have to use different pesticides or stronger pesticides in order to eradicate the species and to not have so many problems in the crops. So we have some protection by law for our human health when it comes to pesticides. So the EPA and the Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration will regulate the sale, but they don't necessarily have a lot of time and money to be able to go out and test all these things. So really the company just has to prove that there are no noticeable side effects to human health, but they don't really have to have in-depth studies or anything like that. Some have done better than others. But there's the regulation on pesticides and fungicides and insecticides are sadly not that great. So an insecticide is going to kill bugs, just so we can clarify here. A fungicide kills fungus, and rodenticide kills rodents like moles and um, uh, burrowing critters like that. Usually moles are what they're going after. So instead of just using a strictly chemical-based process for controlling pests, we can use some alternatives, and we'll go through some examples of what these things do. So because they have different purposes. So one of the ways is through biological pest control, and in this one you're using a predator of the pest, and you're introducing it. And so we have to be careful whenever we introduce a species to make sure that there's not going to be unintended consequences of, if it doesn't have any predators or if it's not going to die off easily, then we don't necessarily want to introduce it into the ecosystem. In this particular, so the gypsy moth did a lot of damage to our deciduous forests in the northeast, particularly the oak and maple. They will actually, they make tents and stuff, and they actually will defoliate. They'll take off all the leaves of all the trees in an area. So they are extremely harmful to the tree populations. So you introduce, and also to other plant populations as well. So the wasp, what this wasp does is it's not really biting the moth right now. What it's doing is it's laying its eggs in the moth, or in the caterpillar. And it uses the caterpillar as like an incubator, essentially. And the wasp larvae will live inside of the caterpillar and eat it, and it'll kill the larvae. So, or it'll kill the caterpillar. And so they use it to control the moth population, because the wasps then just fly away and leave. And when the larvae goes through its life cycle and becomes a wasp, it's going to fly up and leave too. So it doesn't hang about in the area, and it doesn't cause other problems with other species at all. It's just going after the caterpillar. We talked a little bit about genetic engineering already, and that's another way to control pests, is to genetically engineer the plant. So you can see how the plant on the right has been genetically engineered to taste bad, essentially, to the caterpillars, and so they don't eat it. And we don't eat the leaves of the tomato plant anyhow, and so it doesn't impact the human populations at all. So there were some other methods that were on here, so we can try to fool them. The pheromones, so what they'll do is actually put out pheromones that will attract the pest, so it smells like the female is ready to mate, and it'll lure the males in, and then it'll trap the males, and then they can't replicate anymore. Some of the hormones they'll release will signal to the males that the females are ready to mate, but the females really aren't ready to mate, and so that disrupts their life cycle, so that they're not actually mating at the right time, and so then you don't have any reproduction that are in there. We talked a little bit about the natural enemies. Building homes for pest enemies, that's like building bat boxes in areas. Bats feed on the insects. We put the house there for the bat. We try to encourage the bats to come into that area. So when we're looking for making our food production more sustainable and causing less damage to the environment, some of the things that we've already talked about, we're having the polyculture, having those multiple different kinds of species in an area, which will decrease the pests that are in the area. It decreases the possibility of plant diseases spreading through, like fungus and rot and things like that. We want to stick to the more organic fertilizers as opposed to the chemical fertilizers. We want to use efficient irrigation. The one that's showing here in the picture is actually showing where the water is delivered to the root systems of the plants instead of spraying water out. You think about like your the sprayers in the grass or in the parks or something like that. There's a lot of waste that happens in there, so we want to make our irrigation efficient so we have less evaporation, which means less dissolved solids left behind, which causes that soil salinization. We want to rotate our crops. We want to conserve our soil so that we have better soil to grow more crops on. So Some of these other things we'll talk about a little bit more, especially when we talk about water resources. So what is soil conservation? We just mentioned it. Soil conservation is the way that they till the soil in order to decrease the loss of nutrients and the loss of topsoil due to erosion. And so you're going to have a higher crop yield because you're going to have more fertile soils. And that's how, where it says raises soil carbon content, that's one of the nutrients in soil that makes it more fertile in there. So when we leave behind, the no-till is where we don't turn over the soil at all. And the minimum tillage is where so to till it means to turn it over. So minimum tillage, we do it only a little bit. And so they'll harvest the crop, but they'll leave behind like corn stalks and things like that to lay on top of the ground to help protect the soil from erosion. And then also as that decomposes, it goes back down into the soil and breaks down and acts basically like a natural fertilizer. It reduces the water use because whenever you cover the soil, it retains more water because it's not exposed to the air, so evaporation can't occur as quickly. We don't need as many pesticides because especially if we're doing polyculture in addition to this, then we're lowering our pesticide use. If you're not tilling as much, then you're not running your tractors as much, which means you're not using as much fuel. And then we talk about different kinds of plowing. So terracing is what you do on hillsides. It's basically like making stair steps up the side of the hill, if you think like Machu Picchu or something like that. Contour plowing is where we go, instead of going straight up and down the hill, we go around the hill and we stay on the same line of elevation so that way the water's not running down. And then windbreaks are where we plant trees. And in the picture, you can see right along here there's a windbreak. And it's just where they plant at the edges of the fields, they plant some of the trees in order to reduce the wind blowing across it, kind of stops it. So government policies do try to help with our food production. Sometimes it's good things, sometimes it's hard to put like an absolute that this is good or bad. We do control prices through the government, which is good because that way you're not spending $7 on a gallon of milk. Part of that happens because of subsidies, so the farmers can stay in business and so that people can still have their products. So when we talk about influencing food production, if we let the marketplace decide, we could increase hunger a lot in our nation. So, some of these things, while it may decrease food production, that might not be necessarily a good thing. So we kind of have to keep in mind that we do have a human population that we have to support in addition to an environment that we need to protect.